Welcome to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops media availability on Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation, The Joy of Love. I am Norma Montenegro Flynn, Assistant Director of Media Relations at the USCCB. And just this morning, the Vatican released Amoris Laetitia, or The Joy of Love, Pope Francis' apostolic exhortation on love in the family. This exhortation is the result of a process initiated by Pope Francis in 2013 and discussed by the Synod Fathers in 2014 and 2015. Joining us today to talk about the exhortation and to answer your questions are Archbishop Joseph Kurtz of Louisville, Kentucky, President of the USCCB and one of the Synod Fathers. Also joining us is Bishop Richard Malone of Buffalo, New York, Chairman of the USCCB Committee on Laity, Marriage, Family Life and Youth, and Helen Alvarez, Professor of Law and Religion at the Antonin Scalia Law School at George Mason University. Welcome. Each of our speakers will say a few opening remarks, and then we will take your questions. Archbishop Kurtz.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you all for viewing this special session. It's a day of great joy. Allow me, before I read my opening statement, to simply quote the first sentence of the beautiful apostolic exhortation of the joy of loving. Here's what our Holy Father says: "The joy of love experienced by families is also the joy of the Church." I joyfully welcome Amoris Laetitia, the joy of love. It's a much anticipated post-synodal apostolic exhortation of Pope Francis. The Pope has given us a love letter first of all to families, a letter inviting all of us, especially married couples and families, never to stop growing in love. It's also a love letter to the Church, to the family of God, helping us and reminding us to realize more and more her mission both to live and to love as a family. Pope Francis is calling us through this letter to enter more deeply into the beauty of marriage and of Christ's teaching. From the opening lines of Genesis to the closing chapter of Revelation and throughout the Gospels, God speaks eloquently to us about the joy and the challenges of marriage and family life. Now, our Holy Father is giving us really an active opportunity to reflect upon how each one of us can belong more deeply to Christ. The joy of love is inviting us to both share the treasure and the medicine of Jesus. The teaching of Jesus inspires us to live out God's hope for us, and the mercy of Jesus heals and sustains us when we fall short. Let us remember that no obstacle is too big for Christ to overcome. I really encourage each one of us to read and to reflect carefully on the words of Pope Francis, how they can be applied to our lives, our families, and our society. I am really grateful again to our Holy Father for encouraging us and for leading us in a call to encounter Jesus ever more deeply, especially in the great gift of family life, and to be Jesus' missionary disciples to the world. Thank you. Thanks, Norma.
Thank you, Archbishop. Now, Bishop Malone.
Thank you, Norma. Thank you, Archbishop, too.
Absolutely.
In the joy of love, our Holy Father has given to us, to all of us, a very, very beautiful and stirring reflection on love in the family. No one can read this without being touched in some way, and I would say touched deeply. The way the Pope has of moving our hearts and at the same time of challenging our pastoral ministry to become more missionary is what's going on here. More like Jesus, which the Holy Father constantly calls us to become, reaching and touching people not in the abstract, but in the concrete reality of their lives. The Church in the U.S. is well poised to receive the Holy Father's exhortation. Our diocesan and parish ministries, our movements, and countless apostolates continue to help open young people and couples to the grace of God, really all of us, a theme rightly emphasized by Pope Francis. We stand with families, and we seek to support those who are touched by poverty, trafficking, immigration challenges, domestic violence, and pornography. We also have room to grow and improve, and we welcome the Pope's encouragement of a renewed witness to the truth and beauty of marriage and of a more tender closeness with couples and families who are experiencing real difficulties, many of which the Pope highlights details in the document. In reading through Pope Francis' exhortation, I'm struck by themes that complement and enhance the rich teaching we have received from the Second Vatican Council and recent popes, especially St. John Paul II and Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. Pope Francis is calling us to a deeper application of the Church's teaching and pastoral mission, both to further the vocation and mission of married couples and families, and to advance a pastoral care and discernment that will seek to heal wounds. He is inviting us to pause in reflection with him, to let ourselves be renewed and challenged, and to take up his call for a missionary conversion and ever closer accompaniment. This accompaniment upholds the full truth of God's plan while meeting families where they are, walking with them towards ever deeper conversion to Jesus. Amoris Laetitia beckons to be received and reflected upon in its entirety, a very important point. As Pope Francis has urged, I look forward to taking the opportunity to pause upon and not to rush through his teaching. It is so rich. It will surely be a great encouragement to married couples and families and to all engaged in marriage and family life ministry and advocacy. Thank you. Thank you, Norma.
Thank you, Bishop. And now, Helen Alvarez.
Thank you, Norma, and thank you to you both. I'm a professor of family law in the U.S. With a special focus in teaching, scholarship, and also really in public service on the matter of marriage regarding the poor and the situation of women and children. So I thought I would highlight a few things in the document that speak directly to the U.S. context as I see it. The first thing is this document is a promise that the Church will be dramatically active in the arena of the family. And given how the state is really stepping back from the support that marriage needs and that marriage and children together need, I think this is a fabulous development. I just can't be grateful enough for Pope Francis stepping that up. Second, I think the Pope balances well the natural longing for marriage with a really, I almost would use the word raw appreciation of how bad the situation can be on the ground. He refers to people who think that marriage is evil, he quotes Benedict, one of my favorite lines from Deus Caritas Est, where Benedict says, basically, doesn't the Church blow the whistle on sex when it's about to become divine? And the Pope says, people think this is how we teach about sex. People are afraid of children. Marriage is an empty ritual for some. So he really understands how bad the situation is on the ground. One of the things I'm struck most by, and it comes up at least a dozen times in the document, is his appreciation for the fact that people are struggling toward marriage because of drastic individualism. Again and again, he says things like, listen, this is another person, like you're a person. This person has interests and feelings and values. You need to be polite. You need to be kind. You need to listen. And I think he's identified a part of the very core of the American difficulty with marriage, which is the concern with oneself and the idea of building a life together where you're really turning over your concerns largely to someone else who you've now put at the center of the universe. He really gets that. I really enjoyed his lengthy discourse on St. Paul's, love is patient, love is kind. I think this is a little, I think it's very interesting how he picked up on that. We know that most people read this at their wedding. We also know what the divorce rate is. And I think by his catechesis on every single piece of this, he is essentially saying to couples, think about every line of this and what it really means. I can imagine pastors at weddings taking that piece of this apostolic exhortation and using it as a sermon because it says, do you really know what you just had read? The document speaks to losses affecting marriage and the family that are external, right? Poverty, immigration, the unemployment situation, the economy. The United States situation is rather drastic respecting marriage in that we have flourishing marriage among the well-off and a significant loss of marriage and marital childbearing among the poor. The document does not take that on as much as the U.S. situation desperately needs it. It begins to recognize the problem, but our problem is drastic. It's the single largest aspect of the wealth gap, and it's part of the race gap in the United States. And I think we can take that even further here. The document celebrates feminism. The Pope says this, and I like feminism. It also celebrates what the man and the woman both bring to marriage. So I think there's a wonderful balance there. It has enormous children's rights language, and that's a special area of mine. Children's rights is a huge, and you can see it's a passionate, emotional concern of the Holy Father, and I absolutely love that. He also has very strong language about the rights of parents, particularly as against an ever-intrusive state. And that's some of the strongest language I've ever seen in a church document on that. And finally, in addition to stressing parents' rights with respect especially to the education of their children, they also, or twice in the document, he stresses conscientious objection and it being a right of Catholics in these difficult arenas where family issues come face to face with trampling upon religious freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Helen. Also, for reporters, please remember if you plan to ask a question, you can dial *1 now. Also, try to keep your questions short since we have limited time. Let us know who you're directing your question to. And also, if you're following the live stream, please mute the audio on the live stream so we avoid any feedback disruptions. So we go now to our call manager, Eric, who is on the line, and we're ready to take questions from reporters. Eric?
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question, please signal by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. If you're using a speakerphone, please make sure your mute function is turned off to allow your signal to reach our equipment. Again, press *1 to ask a question. And we'll take the first question from Lori Goodstein with the New York Times.
Hi, thanks for doing this. This is a question for Archbishop Kurtz or Bishop Malone about, as concrete as you can get, how is this going to affect practice in parishes? Isn't it the case that priests already counsel and meet with couples who are in irregular situations, divorced couples? What's going to be different about, what kind of instruction are you going to be giving priests about what they should be doing differently now? And in particular, if you can speak of what happens with divorced and civilly remarried couples.
Well, let me take a shot at it first, then Archbishop. Clearly, throughout the exhortation, Pope Francis' constant theme of accompaniment is a strong, strong principle. He calls us constantly to walk with people in whatever be the situation of their lives. And so when it comes to our ministry with married people, including folks who are in situations of divorce and remarriage, the Pope is calling us to very much to embrace all of our people, whatever be their situation, to listen to their stories, to do everything we can to make sure they never feel excluded from the life of the Church. I think that's point number one.
Thanks, Bishop Malone. You said it well. Laurie, good to hear from you, by the way. And I would add this. You mentioned, is there not something that priests have been doing all along? First of all, remember, our Holy Father spends most of his time talking directly to families. And so this is a message that is going not just to the bishop and priest, but this is going to every family. And I think that is especially encouraging and inviting. You're right, priests at their best and leaders within the church have accompanied people. and have walked with them. And so in some ways, this will be an encouragement for people. But there's also a tendency sometimes to fit people into categories. And I think what our Holy Father is saying, and I'll build on what Bishop Malone just said, is he's saying, don't forget to see people as unique. In other words, he says at one point, don't throw stones. The teaching is not changing. He's not giving new regulations or new rules, but he is giving a mindset in which we see the person first. I think that can have great effect. I know in the Archdiocese of Louisville, even at our priest council meetings, we've been talking a lot about what does it mean to have a pastoral heart? And I'll tell you, I've been blown away by some of the wonderful examples. I learned a lot just from hearing some of our priests. I think this is going to be a great incentive for us to do that. And I suspect, whereas maybe last September, when our Holy Father issued the motu proprio on annulments, there were very specific changes. Here, we don't have that, you're right. But we do have, I think, a call in some ways to reach out and to find new ways to walk with people. So I think it's both, and I think the new emphasis is giving the average family an opportunity to read firsthand what our Holy Father is saying directly to each family.
Thank you, Archbishop. Are there any more questions, Eric?
Yes, our next question is from Addie Mino with Catholic News Agency.
Hello. This question is also for Archbishop Kurtz and Bishop Malone, and it's along the same lines of the last question as far as what the bishops and pastors will be doing to implement the ideas in the document, particularly those put forth in Chapter 6. And Bishop Malone, you mentioned that the U.S. is particularly well situated to be putting those plans in action. I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more about what that might look like going forward.
Sure, thank you for great questions. In response, first of all, to the second one, quickly, I believe that we have been taking very seriously, especially in recent years, but before that, the ministry, the sacred and important ministry of walking with our engaged couples in preparation for marriage. And I think we have to strengthen that. I intend, when I get back to Buffalo, my diocese, to look at what I really believe is already a very good marriage preparation program, but to see how it can be improved and enhanced by the Holy Father's call. And also in the exhortation is a call for us to continue walking with our married couples after marriage through all the different phases and challenges of life. I want to make sure we are setting ourselves up to do that more effectively. The first answer is, the first question, of course, is another important one you raise, and that is that in this whole effort to take seriously the Holy Father's writing, we cannot rush our interpretation of what we have here. This document, I believe, needs to be read slowly over and over again in its wholeness. I'll admit for myself, just having received it a little over a day ago with some late night reading, I'm just through it one time. That's not enough. As one of my old philosophy professors used to say, there's no text apart from context. So we don't want to be taking out bits and pieces of it and trying to interpret them without looking at them in the whole. So I need more time.
I would add to what Bishop Malone said so beautifully, that I think every aspect of church ministry is going to be affected, but I do believe that the proximate preparation of married couples and before their marriage, but also after their marriage, is going to probably be the largest impact. I've been at this long enough that in the late 1970s, I was part of bringing together common policies within the diocese where I served at that time. And we're in the process right now of renewing that, always beginning by saying thank you to the people who have been in the trenches, who have been good models and working with young engaged couples. I think we have especially a lot to do in supporting couples once they're married. I think that's going to be a great avenue, and I believe the area of mentoring, and I know, Helen, you and I talked before the conference today about this, the idea of calling forth mentors, people who really are missionaries for marriage and for family, is going to be, I think, a major effort on our part, really a major opportunity.
And we're ready for the next question.
And we'll go to Tom Roberts with National Catholic Reporter.
Thank you, and thank you for doing this. This is a document, I agree, that needs to be read slowly and several times, but we don't have that time at the moment. And I wanted to point out, I guess we're all interested in this implementation idea. How do you get to this? And throughout the document, the Pope also really levels a criticism at the Church and calls on things. He says it can no longer simply be said that all those in any irregular situation are living in a state of mortal sin and are deprived of sanctifying grace. And by thinking that everything is black and white, we sometimes close off the way of grace and of growth and discourage paths of sanctification which give glory to God. Those kinds of comments are seated throughout the document and seem aimed at the level of priests and bishops and those who are in charge of the community. Do you, Bishops Malone and Archbishop Kurtz, see an effort in the future of bishops to really teach about this, to really go into the seminaries and approach this, if I can say, a new way of being more pastoral? Will it have an effect at different levels?
Tom, let me start, and maybe Bishop Malone could add. Thanks, good to hear from you, and a great question. The first thing I would say is a 250-page document. Our Holy Father wisely said, now be patient and take your time in unpacking it. And so we're going to need to do that. I understand that. I also would have to say that much of what our Holy Father is saying is the fruit of conversations that have occurred in both synods that I had the privilege to participate in over the last 2 years, and also in much of his teaching, his catechetical teaching on Wednesdays. I would need to say that our Holy Father is calling for us to have a pastoral mindset. Now, I think most seminaries would say, listen, we're trying to do that, but I think there's going to be new incentives so that if there is a tendency among a bishop or a priest to simply place someone in a category in a very abstract way, there's a call for us to do things differently. I think we're going to start to discover some of the wonderful pastoral work that's already being done, and more needs to be done. I'm going to reference also what Helen said at the very beginning of the very dire situations in the lives of so many people who I think are not even aware they can turn to the Church. And so I would anticipate that this particular apostolic exhortation will have an effect in our seminaries. I think Evangelii Gaudium has already had, I think, a great effect on the joy of the gospel and going out. So I think you're right. And this year, I think, is going to be especially an important year for us to begin to unpack and see how we can, in a sense, operationalize many of the things that our Holy Father is saying.
No, I couldn't agree more. I agree with your point, too, that while certainly the responsibility of us who are bishops and priests and other pastoral leaders is a priority, it is, as the Archbishop says, a beautiful teaching addressed to everyone, to all of the faithful and to everyone of goodwill who will take time to really to read and learn from this document. So I know that my task, going back to my diocese, is to meet with my staff to study this carefully over time, and then to find every way we can to introduce the message of the Holy Father in all of its invitation and all of its challenge to the whole community of Catholics in the Diocese of Buffalo, in my case.
I'm going to add one other thing to what Bishop Malone just said. I forgot to say this, Tom. I think we also need to be able to put in the hands of people of the wonderful challenge that is being given to a family. You know, a good teacher always aims high and always says to a family, you don't realize how much good is already there. You don't realize how much can already be done. And I can point to so many places in the document in which our Holy Father really challenges some attitudes that are very sacrificial, they're very self-giving, they're humble, they're wanting to see the beauty of the Church. So I think the call is for the whole Church, and by that I mean the bishops, the priests, the lay leadership, but also each family to be able to say, God has given me such beauty in my family. Things with his help can be much more. And I think that's when he's talking about the grace that is at work in each one of our lives.
Thank you. And we have time for a couple more questions.
The next question is from Kevin Clark with America Media.
Hello, thank you. I believe I'll address this question to Bishop Malone. Before this document was released, there was a great period of trembling, I guess. Many people were talking about the document in somewhat apocalyptic terms. Some are treating it or be concerned about it as sort of an end run around teaching for instance, divorced and remarried people to get back to the communion line. What do you say to those folks about, now that we've seen it, how do you respond to those concerns? And what does it practically mean for people who haven't been able to live a full sacramental life with the church? How do they... I've been struggling to read between the lines. Maybe someone could put it in more direct terms for me. What happens to those folks? Thank you.
Well, what happens to those, and that's a critical question clearly in the document. We have to remember the exhortation, while looking at difficult situations in people's lives and how they impact marriage and family, the whole exhortation is a celebration of the joy of love. It's a very positive statement in which, as we've already said, and Helen made it very clear, the Pope does not avoid or sidetrack the tough issues. So what we have to commit to with this call from the Holy Father is a much more intentional journey as church, as we walk with our people through all of the joys and hopes and also all of the sadness and difficulties of marriage and family life. That's where we're going to have to examine our consciences, examine our programs, look at everything over time illuminated by the Holy Father's teaching.
Another question?
And there are no questions remaining in the queue.
Okay, well, thank you very much. On behalf of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, we thank you for joining us today, and we thank you for your time. Have a good day.